Have you ever seen a movie that feels a little too real? Well, today we're unpacking a sci-fi thriller that took that feeling to a whole other level. It's called Marooned, a film from 1969 whose story was so spot on, it felt less like fiction and more like a terrifying prophecy.
So that's the big question here, right? Could a movie actually predict a real-life disaster? How on earth did a Hollywood film starring huge names like Gregory Peck and Gene Hackman manage to basically forecast one of the most famous crises in the entire history of space exploration? Just look at this timeline. 4 months. That is it. That's the razor-thin margin between this movie hitting theaters and the moment the entire world held its breath for the crew of Apollo 13. A fictional nightmare about a crippled Apollo capsule became a horrifying reality in less time than it takes for the seasons to change. It's just wild.
And this is where the story gets really personal. This wasn't just some weird coincidence people noticed from afar. No. The commander of Apollo 13, Jim Lovell, and his wife Marilyn, they actually saw the movie right before his mission. This quote from Marilyn Lovell is just haunting. It anchors this whole strange story in a very real, very human fear that was about to become all too familiar.
So let's really unpack this chilling prophecy. It's just 3 months before the Apollo 13 launch, and Commander Jim Lovell and his wife Marilyn go see Marooned. And the plot, 3 astronauts stranded because of an oxygen system failure, was just terrifyingly close to home. The experience gave Marilyn these recurring nightmares. And get this, those nightmares later inspired that famous tense dream sequence in the Ron Howard movie Apollo 13. So you have to be wondering, how did a movie get so frighteningly close to a future reality? Well, it wasn't a lucky guess. The answer is much more interesting. It all came down to an almost obsessive commitment to realism. Now, okay, the specific mechanical problems were different, but the core crisis? It was identical. 3 men trapped in a tiny capsule with their oxygen running out. You have to remember, this film came out right after the Apollo 11 moon landing. The public was totally space literate. They knew the lingo, they knew the tech, so the filmmakers knew they absolutely had to deliver.
And saying they got it right is a massive understatement. They used an actual Apollo spacecraft boilerplate for their sets, from the same design family as the one from the tragic Apollo 1 fire. They filmed on location at the real Cape Kennedy and in Houston. They even spliced in actual launch footage of Apollo 11. The final product was so convincing that NASA, who, by the way, initially wanted the film shut down, ended up giving it an official commendation for accuracy. This kind of obsessive realism, it doesn't just happen. It takes visionaries. And a huge amount of the credit for how this movie looks and feels goes to the director of photography, a man who is already a legend in Hollywood. The cinematographer was Daniel L. Fapp. I mean, just look at his resume here. It's incredible. The guy already had an Oscar for West Side Story. He was an absolute master of his craft, and he brought all of that experience to bear on the unique challenge of how to light the endless, empty void of space.
Fapp didn't just light scenes, he told the story with light. Inside the capsule, as the oxygen depletes, the light itself actually starts to die, making you feel that claustrophobia. Then you cut to mission control, and it's all sterile, wide, and uniformly lit, like looking at specimens in a fishbowl. And back on Earth, the scenes with the astronauts' wives are all warm and soft, a stark contrast to the cold, hard reality their husbands are facing.
Now, this kind of meticulous artistic filmmaking costs a lot of money and takes real conviction. But the film's journey to the screen almost took a very different and much cheaper path. There's another legendary name attached to this movie, and it's a story of a major Hollywood what if.
Frank Capra. Yes, that Frank Capra, the man behind classics like It's a Wonderful Life. He spent years developing this project, but in a really tragic twist of fate, this sci-fi thriller would mark the end of his incredible decades-long career. So why did he walk away? Well, the studio offered him just $3 million to make the film. He knew it wasn't nearly enough to achieve the kind of realism the story absolutely demanded, so he abandoned it. The final film, made just a few years later, ended up costing $8 million. Capra was proven right, but he never stepped behind a camera again. So, with this incredibly realistic, prophetic story and 2 Hollywood legends attached to it at different points, you'd think this movie was a monster hit. But it wasn't. And that's where the story gets even more fascinating. Despite its accuracy, despite its Oscar-winning special effects, Marooned was a box office failure. It just didn't make its money back. Maybe the public was just experiencing some space fatigue after Apollo 11. Whatever the reason, people didn't show up. By all commercial metrics, the film was a flop.
But here's the paradox. This so-called flop had an absolutely incredible legacy. Its realism directly inspired Alfonso Cuarón's masterpiece Gravity. Its plot about a U.S.-Soviet rescue helped influence the real-life Apollo-Soyuz joint mission in 1975. It even became a blueprint for developing rescue plans for the Skylab space station crews. Think about that. Fiction literally became engineering fact.
So it leaves you with this final thought. Marooned lost money, it got satirized for being too slow, and it pretty much faded from public memory. But it also gave a warning. It inspired a future Oscar winner, and it actually influenced U.S. space policy. So what really defines a film's success? Is it the opening weekend box office, or is it the ripples it leaves across culture, technology, and even real life decades later?